The April 12th, 2012 meeting of the Teachers Retirement Board. Jennifer, could you please call roll?
Sure. For the State Treasurer, Mr. Boykin. Here. For the Director of Finance, Mr. Reyes.
Present.
Mr. Lawson.
Here.
Ms. Hendricks.
Here.
Mr. Keeley.
Here.
Mr. Rosensteel.
Here.
For the Superintendent of Public Instruction, Ms. Zumant.
Here.
And for the State Controller, Mr. McGuire.
Here.
Chairperson Dillon, you have a quorum.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. At your seats, you were given some materials, one of which was the new education item, the board education. So if you could insert that in our consent agenda, which is item number 15C. Also, you have received the PowerPoint presentation on the CARM project from Grant Thornton. Grant Thornton, right?
Grant Thornton, that'll be their presentation to you later in the day.
What item is that, Jack? I was trying to find it and I couldn't find it really quickly.
11.
So that's item number 11. And with those two additions to your materials, I'd entertain a motion to approve the agenda and work plan.
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any comment? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. That is passed. Jack, we're on to item number 2, and I'm going to turn this over to you.
Great, thank you very much. As the individuals that were here in our prior committee know, unlike the CalPERS statutes, your statutes require an annual election of chair and vice chair, and this is the time that we do that. And it's pretty straightforward. We'll ask for motions nominating individuals for each office and take a vote. So I will start with the office of chair. So are there any motions to nominate individuals for chair of the board for 2012-13?
I'll nominate Dana Dillon for chair.
Well, that's right. I can't turn on your mic from here, so I'll repeat that. So can you say it a little louder, Sharon?
Sure. I nominate Dana Dillon for chair.
Okay, we have a nomination from Sharon Hendricks to nominate Dana Dillon as chair.
I'll second that nomination. Second.
Actually, we don't need seconds for this, but thank you very much. But thank you. And we have a second from Pedro Reyes for the nomination. Sorry, it's a little hard to hear without the mic system managing it back here. Do we have any other motions for chair? Seeing that, then we'll close the nominations, and I'll ask for acclamation. All in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Oppose? All right, congratulations.
Thank you.
Chair Dillon.
Thank you very much.
So you're ready for another round, huh?
Yeah, I'm going to go for another year.
You haven't had enough.
I'll go another year. All right. So do you do vice chair, or do I get to do vice chair?
Historically, I do that, but
You're gone.
I
You're
will
gone.
do that.
You're
then.
on. Go for
Then
it.
nominations are open for vice chair of the board. Do we have any motions? Ms. Zumant.
I'd like to nominate Mr. Harry Keeley for vice chair.
Motion from Michelle Zumant to nominate Harry Keeley as vice chair for 2012-13. Seconds are not needed, but do we have any other motions for vice chair? Seeing no other motions, we'll close that, and I ask for all in favor of the motion, please say aye. Opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Congratulations, Mr. Keeley.
The two of us get to torture y'all for another year. All righty. So, election done. We're moving on to item number 3, the board meeting calendar. I think this went out to everyone early for some additional input, but we will put it open for any comments that anyone might have.
The only adjustment we made, just in case you all didn't catch it, I had a couple questions from several of you, was in October. That is your offsite, so we must lock down those dates to lock up a hotel. So I just want to make sure that if we agree to this today, Mary's got to do her work to get you a site to have that. But we moved it over a day. It's a tight week. It's a tight month. It just everything is trying to fit together sequentially. But because the CII meeting is on Thursday and Friday. I assume there'll be a couple board members that would like to attend that. That would necessitate then flying. Luckily, it's not too far away on the evening of the 3rd to Seattle. So it's a little tight, but that's the best we can do, figuring all of everyone's calendars we were trying to juggle. So that was the only change I believe we made since the draft we sent you.
Michael?
My only comment was the schedule in November. It's the day after the election,
Yes.
and some of us might be busy.
We hope.
We hope.
Definitely be busy.
Either way,
We will
some
be
of us
busy
might be busy.
up
Yeah.
to that
Okay.
day, and hopefully celebrating the day off.
Yeah. Just if it were possible to move it, that's my only comment.
Yeah.
So Jack, what did we run into in November? Was it PERS that was the next week?
Usually the PERS meetings are in there. That's why I don't know for sure their calendar. I don't know if Grant or Terry have at their fingertips in November of 12, if their meeting is in that second week, or if we could move.
I think it is in the 12 is Monday.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 12 to 14.
So Michael, that kind of puts us either the week before.
Well, why don't we try, we could just try and be super efficient in that monthly calendar and try and avoid having a third day and just really make Thursday and Friday
Solid days.
solid days and try to, do our best not to do that.
And be
Just,
aware of the election.
it's probably that, I'm not sure you're going to do better in another week, but how about we try and get rid of Wednesday in there?
Yeah, I just presume that,
Oh, I'm sorry, Michael.
some subset of this board is going to be celebrating.
Celebrating or in depression,
Yeah.
depending on partisan activity. Right.
Yeah, either way, somebody's going to be
Right.
celebrating.
That's right. So I'll make mental note of that we'll try and push hard to have everything scheduled up on the 8th and 9th.
Peter, were you okay? Okay.
I'll save my voice.
All right.
And I'll actually formally take it off so it doesn't show up as the 7th right now, if you adopt the calendar as you've got it here.
Take the 7th off?
Yeah, I said we're not misleading people that were coming in that day. I'll actually take that 7th off.
Can I just ask about,
Go ahead, Sharon, cue in, and
sorry.
that's okay. There you go.
So just about committees, I just don't know what the rhythm is in terms of our different board meetings and how many committees meet. So like in November, do we typically have a wealth of committees meeting?
Right, well, in July, you're going to map out each month with board items, so now we'll apply that screen, I think, a little bit to what we do in November. You don't have Chris's semi-annual investment reports, which are April and September. You always hit. Those always take up a good block of time, so that's a good thing that month. That means we won't have that burden. We won't have any actuarial pieces that month, so I'm just thinking on top of my head, it might be a good month actually to have a little bit of a compressed schedule. The overall theory, though, I thought maybe you were asking a larger question, is we try and make the schedule graduated, and the lesser attended committees are the earlier days, so you don't force 9 or 12 people to all come in for a full 3 days because it is such a burden. And then we've tried to, and I hope you'll all notice the comment in here, we've tried to at least pick 2 committees that are mutually exclusive in membership, just so we can have some concurrency of meeting. And the 2 that we've tagged historically are audits and appeals, to try and keep them separate. That really is what makes your meetings work the way they are. If you had them sequential, you'd really be very stretched.
Yeah.
So if you keep on that plane, I think we've been doing pretty well to having this 2.5 days, 2.25 days.
Another option that perhaps we can take a look at, and if the board would think about it, is if we did eliminate one of the days in November, that we do have one day scheduled in December, and we could tack on maybe another day
Right,
if
we
we
will-
needed to business-wise.
Right, and at some point, you don't have to do it today, but maybe in July, we would want your guidance, because last year you did something special. You did use the day in December to have a board-only closed session meeting with your investment consultants. And it'd be nice to know if you want to do that type of exercise again, and that day particularly would be tagged for that purpose.
All right, Sharon, are you?
Yeah, I guess I would just comment that I like the idea of us maybe in July talking about maybe adding a day in December, just because I appreciate what Mr. Lawson's mentioning. I think a lot of us will be engaged in November, but I would like to have the option to add a day in December, so.
Eric?
Along what Jack was saying, some of the meetings are singular days in the calendar, and historically we've either used them or not used them. I've had an opportunity, and I apologize, I haven't mentioned this to the chair yet, but I had an opportunity to speak recently with Mr. Edelman about, with the changes that are taking place at the board level, that we may, at some point in the next year, fiscal year, July 1, 12 through June 30th, 13, depending upon who's on the board, we may want to use some of these single days for educational opportunities that are solely directed towards the portfolio.
Sure.
And analysis of the portfolio, et cetera. So I just want to raise that to the awareness of everyone that's here now and potentially the 3 other new board members that are here.
All right. Any further discussion? Right. We do have this as an action item. We don't necessarily have to have a motion if we have consensus after removing the 7th. And do we at least have consensus of moving forward with the dates that we have? Alrighty. Jack, you good with that?
Yep, that's
All
great.
right.
We'll go ahead and make all the arrangements then. Thank you.
Alrighty. Item number 4 is not necessarily for action either, although it's listed. I would request that you spend some time perhaps today taking a look at the committees and your committee preferences and whether you would like to serve as chair or vice chair and get that into me today. Then Harry and I can sit down with Jack and we can delineate the committees and then have that information available for you definitely in June.
Yeah, if any, it may have just been Pedro, I'm not sure when you stepped in, Pedro, that in the prior committee, they eliminated the corporate governance committee. That'll be a motion to the board here in a few hours. So I just want to assume those responsibilities in the investment committee. So just draw a line through that then as a committee option here on your sheet on page 17 and just work with the others.
Alrighty. Thank you very much. That moves on to item number 5, and I see Mark and Nick and Rick are all right here in front of us.
We're all ready to go. Good morning, Madam Chair.
Turn that over to you. Thank you. Good morning, Rick.
Mr. Vice Chair, congratulations to both of you again for your elections. We're here today to talk about the annual valuation, and I've got Nick Collier and Mark Alleman here with us again from Milliman out of Seattle, who are going to go over the details of the report. But before I hand it over to Nick, I'd like to point out at least a couple of things. First of all, we have presented to you a new ratio, and it's a ratio that we have looked at for a while, but we've never put in our report. We think it's an important ratio. We think it will kind of help explain where the plan is going. And the ratios are called the volatility ratio. And it's on, the charts are on TRB 72 in your packet. And Nick and Mark will be going over these ratios, and it gives a picture of how your assets and liabilities have fared compared to the active population. And it's a very important ratio in explaining why a percent loss in assets does what it does to your contribution ratio. So Nick and Mark will get deeply into that, and I think it's an important ratio to look at. Other than that, one other note, we've been looking, from time to time I look at the actual reports of other systems and other retirement systems. And particularly we were looking at the actual report of the Department of Defense. And we were looking at their numbers. Their unfunded liability is almost $1 trillion. So it, compared to ours, is a little bit larger. And then one other thing, a couple
Good strategy, Rick. Raise the bar. I see where you're going with this idea, but
we're going to raise a little bit more here. A couple weeks ago, we were at a meeting of actuaries that occurred in Washington, D.C., and the topic of Social Security has come up, and that was one of the highlights. And their report will be introduced probably in May, but last year's report showed an unfunded liability for Social Security of $22 trillion. So with those notes, I'll turn it over to Nick, and he can talk about our unfunded liability.
Well, I'm going to need a moment, so I'll turn it over to Mark. Actually, I'm going to start off here. Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here. So it's once again, it's that time of year when the actuaries come and tell you how much extra money needs to be contributed to the defined benefit program in order to fund it at an appropriate level. So there aren't going to be any large surprises today. As a matter of fact, the contribution scenarios which Ed was looking at you with at the prior meeting were based on the June 30, 2011 assets, which is what this whole report is based on. We're going to go over 4 reports with you. They all have a census date of June 30, 2011. For the defined benefit program, there was a very nice return in the prior year, over 23%. However, there is still a serious need for additional contributions, somewhere in the range of 12.9% of pay. And the longer the wait, the larger those contributions will be. We're also going to go over the Defined Benefit Supplemental Program, DBS, and the CBB. We like to use, of course, letters, Cash Balance Benefit Program. There's good news there. Those are actually over 100% funded as of June 30, 2011. I had to arm wrestle Nick to give that report. And then Nick is going to go over the SBMA, the Supplemental Benefit Maintenance Account report with you. So those are the 4, the Defined Benefit Supplement, the Cash Balance Benefit Program, and the SBMA. The SBMA program maintains purchasing power for retirees, and there's good news there too, in that according to the board regulations, the purchasing power can be maintained at 85%. So without further ado, we'll start in on the defined benefit program. Maybe the one surprise is that after earning 23%, the funded ratio declined from 71% to 69%. Now that seems strange, but that's because the funded ratio is based on the actuarial assets, which recognize 1/3 of the difference between where we expect to be and where we actually are each year. Another way of putting that was that at June 30, 2010, there were about $23 billion in unrecognized losses. Well, earning 23% got rid of most of that. We went down from $23 billion in unrecognized losses to $4 billion in unrecognized losses as of June 30, 2011. If we were to look at a funded ratio based on the fair value or the market value of assets, instead of declining, the funded ratio would have gone up from about 60% to 67%. So that's much better, going from 60 to 67 as opposed to 70. Well, I don't know if it's better because you still end up at a lower point, but the ratio would have increased if we were looking at the market assets. The additional revenue need does decrease slightly. It was about 14.2% of additional payroll if we were to finance the unfunded liability over 30 years, beginning June 30, 2010. That has gone down to 12.9%. Nick will go over that, why that changed with you in detail, as well as the change from the 71 to the 69%. Now, it's important to note that the longer we wait, the larger that increase would be. Waiting 2 years, if we were to start at July 1, 2013, and finance the unfunded liability over 30 years, instead of starting to finance it over 30 years, starting 2 years earlier at July 1, 2011, the required increase is projected to go up from 12.9% of pay to 13.8% of pay. Another way of putting that is that in a rough basis, for every year until the legislature makes a change, the required increase goes up by about 0.5% of pay. So there are real consequences towards waiting to increase the contribution. There is an increase in the supplemental state contribution required. The law currently has 0.524% of pay being made from the state. That increases, according to the parameters, which Nick will go into the details with you, by 0.25% every year until it goes up to 1.505%. So based on this actuarial valuation, the contribution will be going up from 0.524% of pay to 0.724% of pay. The bottom line, again, is that additional revenue is needed. The longer the wait, the larger the increase, and it is very sensitive to future investment return, as we shall see. This chart summarizes better, I think, than any other where the system is and where it was. The strong asset return did improve the DB program's funding, but what we see here is that whereas last year, and when I say last year, I mean based on the June 30, 2010 valuation, we would have projected the fund as running out of money in 2041. Now things are better. We're not projecting it as running out of money for 5 more years, 2046, which still highlights the serious need for additional revenue. Now, this is based on all the actuarial assumptions. This is based on assuming 7.5% returns in each future year. It's based on the actuarial assumptions for how long people will live, how long people will retire. That investment earnings one in particular has a huge impact on where we really go, and we're going to look at some different alternatives as to what future returns could do in terms of that. The red line we like, that's what if we got the additional 12.9% of pay contributions, and that shows the system funding over a 30-year period. So that kind of gives you the big picture, and with that I'm going to turn it over to Nick to look at the details with you.
All right, so really, let's try this again. All right, really there's kind of 4 key ingredients when we put together an actual valuation, and I just want to kind of go over them briefly since we've got some new board members, and just kind of talk about how they compare to last year, and then I'll kind of summarize, how things changed from this year to last year. Looking at the plan data is kind of the first key ingredient. Really, there's kind of about what we'd expected. The one thing from our assumption perspective is that the payroll actually decreased this year. We expect the payroll to increase, and probably that's no surprise to you guys. And obviously, the 2 key reasons were there was a drop in the active teacher population, and additionally, pay was flat with basically almost the same as last year. So with pay increases, we expect about just under 4% of pay increase. So when you have no pay increases, that actually results in lower liabilities, and we'll talk about how that affected the funded ratio. The next key one, obviously we spent a lot of time talking about this in February, so I don't want to go into too much detail, but just to quickly remind you, we looked at both demographic and economic assumptions when we presented the experience study. On the demographic side, the biggest thing was we have projected slightly longer life expectancy, and obviously on the economic side, the real big thing was the net investment return, and that had the most significant impact of all the assumptions, and we'll see how that impacted the valuation as compared to last year's valuation. Now, the third key ingredient is the benefit provisions. I didn't put a slide on that one. Obviously, there's been no changes in the benefit provision, so that did not have an impact on the valuation. Lastly is the actual value of assets. Basically, as Mark talked about, you had about a 23% return, but the way the smoothing works is you only recognize about 1/3 of that gain, and you're also picking up losses that had occurred, really the key loss back in the fiscal year ending 2009 that kind of flowed through. And the key thing on this one is what Mark talked about, is that our smoothed assets on our fair market value now as of June 30, 2011 are almost exactly the same. I think last year I used the analogy of storm clouds on the horizon, so in that respect it's cleared up as of June 30, 2011. There's not any bad news that we're going to show in the funded ratio as of right now that we that we know has been booked and is going to happen in the future. So we combine kind of the first 3 ingredients, the data, the benefit provisions, and the assumptions, and our valuation, basically we're just taking the benefit for all service up to the valuation date for members that are in the plan, and we for like current retirees, we say, okay, we expect them, then we know they have this benefit, they're getting this COLA, we expect them to live this long, and we project this benefit stream, so future benefit payments for that group. And then we do the same thing for the active populations, obviously a little more complicated because we need to project what their benefit's going to be based on salary increases, estimate when they're going to retire, then how long they're going to live on that. But so we put all that together, and then we have, as I said, a stream of benefit payments that are paid out in the future. Now, when we do a valuation, we need a value as of that date. So we use the time value of money, and we say, okay, how much money would we need right now earning our investment return of 7.5% to pay for that stream of benefits? And that number is our actual obligation, which is $208.4 billion, as you can see in this chart. We then compare that to our actual value of assets, which is about $144 billion, and that comes up with our unfunded of $64.5 billion. And obviously the thing we talk about a lot is the funded ratio, which is the relationship of the actual obligation, the actual value of assets divided by the actual obligation. So we're at about 69%. So basically we have 69% of the assets on hand that we'd want to pay for the obligations for benefits earned to date. And this is kind of my favorite chart. Is one thing that we spent a lot of time on the valuation is is looking at exactly what happened and why it happened. And this is what this chart shows. It shows we had a funded ratio of 71.5% last year. And I think there's a couple of key points here. One is that if everything went exactly as planned, we would still have a decrease in our funded ratio of 0.7%. And that's because we don't have adequate funding right now. Therefore, we would expect a decrease, and as Mark showed, obviously that decrease would continue off into the future. The second thing, which is obviously usually probably the most significant thing that usually affects our funded ratio, is the asset gain or loss. And when we talk about asset gain or loss, you remember we're like in relationship to our 7.5% assumption. And you see, combined, there was about a 1% decrease, but it was made up of really two components. One was we were picking up those losses from the prior years. Mark said we pretty much recognized all those prior year losses, which is about a 4%. Was a 4% decrease in the funded ratio, and that was offset by the good returns this year, which increased our funded ratio by 3.1%, and that's, as I said, so we only had about a 1% decrease due to the assets, and that's smoothing, and that's kind of the point of the smoothing, is you don't jump up and down as much. Next is salary variation, which I already alluded to when I was talking about the data. Obviously, if benefits don't go up as much as projected, salaries don't go up as much as projected, then benefits aren't as much as we expected, and that means the liabilities are slightly lower than we would have projected. And you can see that by having lower liabilities, that helped increase our funded ratio by 1.5%. And then the assumption changes, which we already talked about, the experience study, and this is basically about what we estimated, resulted in a 2.2% decrease, and about 2% of that was due to the change in the investment return assumption, lowering from 7.75 to 7.5. And you see that results in a total change of 2.4% decrease. So that takes us from our 71.5 to our 69%. So this valuation is really pretty much informational in a lot of respects, but the one exception is the determination of the required state contributions for the 1990 benefit structure, which Mark already alluded to. In the education code, there's a requirement that if the benefits that were in effect as of 1990 are not sufficiently funded, then there are increases in the state contributions. And last year was the first year we came in and said, this is not the case, and the state contributions need to kick in. And there's a slow graded schedule that Mark kind of talked about. It was about 0.5% the first year and 0.25% till it caps at 1.5% if the 1990 benefit structure does not become sufficiently funded in that time. So it's sort of a complicated valuation exercise, because we have to go back and figure out what the benefits were from 1990, and we have to go back to people who are retired right now. Somebody might be getting a $3,000 a year benefit, but what would they have gotten if it was only the 1990 structure? So we kind of have to calculate how much was attributable to 1990 and how much was not. But anyway, we go through all those calculations, and we come up with an actual obligation of about $170 billion. You can see the $169.7 billion, and that, if you remember, compares to the $208 billion for the full DB program. So you see, the difference is just under $40 billion for the new benefits versus the old benefit structure. And we do, under the education, there's a code, there's a two-part test as whether these contributions kick in. One is there's a normal cost deficit. That was not the case, but there is an unfunded, as you can see in this chart, which is the second part of the test, is that the assets are less, and you note the assets once again are compared to the actual obligation, but those assets are theoretical assets, and that we have calculated that if only the 1990 benefit structure stayed in place, what would the assets be? And you can see there's a deficit there. Since there's a deficit, the state contributions should kick up by an additional 0.25% under the education code. So as I said, that's kind of one of the key findings of this report. Moving to the next one, then we look at the funding sufficiency of the DB program. And to do that, we look at how much contributions we have coming in. Well, right now we have just under 19% of pay in contributions coming in, but we also are projecting that the state contribution will increase, so we factor that in. And when we do our funding, we're doing it over a 30-year period, so we're trying to figure out what the value of the contributions over a 30-year period are. And it works out to about 19.4% of payroll, as you can see from this chart. And we take that 19.4% payroll, we compare it to the normal cost, because we need to take our contributions and pay for our benefits, and that only leaves about, our normal cost is 18.3%, that leaves a little over 1% left to pay off our unfunded amount, which is clearly not sufficient. It does not amortize, it does not pay off our unfunded over any period of time. So then we figure out, well, how much would we need if we were going to fund over a 30-year period, amortization similar to our home loan, paying off our unfunded of about $60 billion. And we find we would need to have about 14% of pay to pay that off. Now, we already have our little over 1% that is already exists, and that means that we need just under 13%, about 12.9% of payroll, in addition to fund our unfunded amount over a 30-year period. And obviously, you've heard from Ed, and Ed's working and trying to figure out a way, somewhere to find that middle ground to pay this off. And as we realize that you're not going to get 12.9% of pay on June 30th, 2011, obviously that would be pretty tough. So, so we understand, with the Ed's working within the parameters he has. But so we want to talk a little bit about how this 12.9%, you could calculate this a number of different ways, and we want to really make sure it's clear how this is calculated and how it's sensitive to other things. So I'm going to spend a little time talking about that. But first of all, I just want to go over, as I said, similar to the funded ratio, what were the key factors that drove a decrease in the additional revenue needed. And remember, the funded ratio went down, but the additional revenue also went down. And this is a pretty similar picture. You see, we had a 0.8% increase in the funded rate, in the contribution rate needed to fund the unfunded amount, and that once again was due to the current underfunding. Now, as Mark talked about, it's really about 0.5% a year. Well, what we have is we have a rolling amortization. It's basically like you're paying your house over 30 years, so as of June 30, 2010, you have your mortgage. Well, a rolling amortization period, you're basically June 30, 2011, you're saying, oh, I'm going to refinance my house over the next 30 years. So you end up with a slight decrease in the contribution rate needed. So by going forward 1 year and pushing off the year we're going to pay off the unfunded amount, we actually end up with a small decrease. Next one, you see the current year asset gain, and this is the key difference between what you see, the factors affecting the funded ratio and the factors affecting the additional revenue needed, is the current year asset gain is fully reflected. And that's because when we do the additional revenue needed, we fully reflect the asset gains and losses, and we effectively don't smooth them. And the reason for that is, particularly a couple years ago, we didn't want to be coming in here and telling you some number that we knew was going to, that was a smooth number, when we knew we had all these losses that we hadn't banked yet. And so we didn't want, Ed going down to the hill and saying, Ed going down to Capitol and saying, hey, we need, 5% of pay, when we know it's going to go up the next year. So that's why under this calculation, we fully reflected the asset gain or loss. And as you can see, because we've done that 21% asset gain ends up with a big impact, and it lowers the additional revenue needed by 3.5%. The other thing, salary payroll variation actually has a pretty small impact. The assumption changes has increased by 2%. Once again, about 1.8% of that was due to the change in the investment return assumption. So bottom line, there's a 1.3% decrease from 14.2 to about 12.9. And now going over the key points on the additional revenue calculation. As I said, the big thing I think is the projection of, we've reflected the projection of losses in our smoothing method. So we've kind of fully reflected all the losses. Now that's not such a big deal because our actual value, our smooth value, and our fair value are pretty close. But a couple years ago, that was a big difference. We've also taken into account that we are expecting the state contributions to increase by 0.25% up to about that 1.5%. So that is reflected in our calculation. So we've taken all the state contributions, so the 12.9% is in addition to what we already expect to get from the state. And it's obviously, as I said, it's based on it's a theoretical value based on a full and immediate increase. And as of June 30th, 2011, we don't know when the increase is going to kick in, and the reality is probably going to be graded in. But we just we just have a fixed measurement date, and so that's why everything's as of June 30th, 2011. And we'll talk about how deferring that will impact it. The last thing is that we're actuaries. In our perfect world, we would like to have some margin for future adverse experience, meaning probably investment losses. Even if we set our thing at 12.9%, if you have losses in the future, then your contribution rate is no longer going to be sufficient to pay over a 30-year period. So just another comment there. As Mark talked about, so I won't spend too much time on this. Each year we defer, there's sort of an additional cost because as we wait, that underfunding kind of drives down our funding ratio and it increases the additional revenue needed. Here you can see our 12.9% was needed in an increase in 2011. If you wait 5 years, it's a little over 15%. And a simple way to look about that, each year that gets deferred, there's about a 0.5% increase in additional revenue needed. We would expect all other things being equal. And I know this is Chris's favorite slide. I know he's already looked at this, and that's why he was working so feverishly away back there. But the point is, we don't expect to invest our way out of it. If you remember back before 1990 or 1985, CalSTRS was actually less than 70% funded before, and they were able to earn their way out of it through contributions and investment return. But the dynamic of where the system is right now, and Mark is going to talk about that, this volatility ratio that Rick was talking about, what it really means is it's much tougher to invest your way out of it, and we just wanted to give some examples. As you can see, if you over 5 years, we need to earn 16% over the 5 years, or even over a 30-year period, we need to earn 9.6, so 2.1% above our 7.5% assumption. So it's not impossible, but it's not a realistic thing to expect the investment returns to bring us out of it. Yeah. Yeah, go right ahead.
Gary?
Nick, can you go back to that previous slide?
Yeah.
That's helpful. I think it may also be helpful if you were able to provide for us some scenarios of what it would take us to get to 75%, 80%, 85%, 90%. I assume this is to get us to 100%.
Yeah, that's correct.
9.6% return on investment over a 30-year period would get us to 100%. But maybe some other models that would show us if we're moving the ball in the right direction.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what we've been working with Ed a lot on, and so. One of the key things, and I like the way you said moving in the right direction. We kind of look at it as kind of a threshold. If you get more contributions in, if you start dropping below 60%, it really becomes hard to start righting the ship. But as long as you're above 60% and you're moving in the right direction, you should continue to move in the right direction. Yeah, we'll work with Ed if you want some specific scenarios or some samples that we'd be happy to. That's definitely something we can provide. So last point about additional revenue needed, obviously, is what investment returns are going to have a big impact on what it is in the future. We've done everything at 7.5%, and that's our 12.9%. Obviously, if we return more, the additional revenue is going to needed is going to be less, and if we earn less, the additional revenue needed is going to be more. And what we've shown here is the two endpoints here are the 25th percentile, so that would be strong investment returns that you'd only expect to return 25% of the time, 8.9%, and 75th percentile, so on the lower end of the investment return spectrum, 5.8%. If we use those for the investment return assumptions, you can see what the additional revenue needed would be. So that's sort of one way to look at the future investment returns, and Mark's going to talk about another here going forward.
So I'm going to talk about the volatility index, which is also what Rick referred to at the beginning of this presentation. The volatility index shows the impact of growing assets on contribution volatility. If you just step way back from it and think the larger the assets are, the larger any percent gain or loss on those assets will be in dollar amounts. And that means that the larger those assets are compared to payroll, they will create a larger increase or decrease in the required contribution as a percent of payroll. So what we look at, since the contributions are calculated as a percent of payroll, the volatility index is the assets divided by payroll. And that helps us to understand contribution volatility. Now on the next slide, we actually show how it's changed over time. You can see that back in 1975, if we were to take the assets and divide them by payroll, it was a ratio of 1. The assets essentially were equal to the overall payroll. Going up to 2011, the assets are now 5.8 times as large as payroll. So there's been a large increase. And as a matter of fact, you can see that this index peaked at the same time that the assets peaked in 2000 and 2007. The volatility index is similar in progress to the progress of the system's assets. Well, why is this important? It's important because any gain or loss on those assets will be reflected in a percent of pay contribution calculation. Specifically, if we were to look at a 10% asset loss, and remember when we're talking about a 10% asset loss, it's 10% below our 7.5% assumption. So a 10% asset loss would be a negative 2.5% return. This gives you kind of a rule of thumb as to what impact that might have long-term on the required contributions if that 10% loss were not offset by future gains. Well, back in 1975, with a volatility index of 1, that would have, over 30 years, because we finance unfunded liability over a 30-year period in our funding policy, that would have required a 0.5% of pay increase to finance the unfunded over 30 years. Now, in 2011, with the volatility index going up from 1 to 5.8, that 10% loss instead of a 1%, excuse me, a 0.5% increase in pay would imply a 2.7% increase in pay. So the larger, it's good to have a lot of assets. We're not trying to imply otherwise, but along with the advantages of having a lot of assets, there is more volatility in the contribution rates because any gain or loss on those assets is larger compared to the payroll that we're trying to pay the unfunded off with. And that's also one of the differences currently in the system's funding from where it was back in 1975, because the assets are that much larger compared to the payroll. It's also at a lower funded ratio. It's harder to pay off the unfunded based on a percent of payroll type calculation. Any questions on this one in particular? This is kind of a new concept before we move on.
Yeah, I don't understand this. So let's
that
go.
was a tough one. I agree.
I agree with Paul.
Okay. So let me start to ask some questions and others can follow.
Very good.
Amen.
So I understand. First of all, I'm assuming this only affects the challenge of paying off the unfunded liability, right? That's what this is.
Correct.
Measuring, right? So
That's
if we were
absolutely correct.
funded, this ratio wouldn't matter whether it's 1 or whether it's 5.8.
Well, it would matter in terms of the risk of becoming unfunded.
Risk if we were to
and
become
paying off the
unfunded.
unfunded liability.
Okay, but it's an issue that says if we have an unfunded liability, then since the unfunded liability is measured relative to our assets, it's the assets we don't have relative to the assets we do have, that obviously the more the base for making a contribution, the salary base, the easier it's going to be in terms of percentage terms to do. Okay, so it's really an issue of addressing the unfunded liability.
Yes.
Now, explain to me, though, this is what's counterintuitive. What, compared to 1975, and I have no idea what was going on in 1975, why is it now bad from this measure to say we've got a lot of assets? I mean, what changed relative to compared to 1975? Was it that salaries? Was it a change in salaries? Was it a change in benefits? Was it a change in funded status, which shouldn't affect this? This is funded status doesn't go into this calculation.
Yeah, let me take that. I mean, this is a totally normal projection of a mature system. We've done this with other systems, exactly what it looks like. And second, I thought you didn't understand this. You actually, you summarized it real well. But I would just go there. There's two things going on here. One is there's paying off, and basically it's that the payroll relative to the amount you need to pay off is low. So that means you have to make higher contribution rates. The second thing here is really why it's called the volatility index, is that when things go up, or it's like when you have an asset loss, in the old days, you could make it up with contributions, because if you had a 1% asset loss, well, 1% of contributions would pay that off in 1 year. But now if you have a 1% asset loss, now you have to have 6% of pay effectively to pay it off in 1 year. So basically everything is just going to move up or down much more going forward than back in the old days. So.
But what I think you said that was interesting was that we have a mature system, so that what you're saying is the accumulated and unpaid benefits relative to the number of people working and contributing into the system has changed since 1975, and that's the real source of the difference. I mean, you take it to the extreme, you close the system, you still have 100,000 people collecting and you've got 10 people contributing. If you've got an unfunded liability, obviously it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Is that the point here? That, I mean, I'm trying to get at why we care about this.
Why we care about it is because the contributions are more volatile because of larger assets, the larger asset pool compared to payroll. So historically what's happened is it's been caused because we have a growing portion of the liability represented by retirees. Those retirees have assets backing up their liabilities which aren't related to any active payroll. So the assets have grown compared to the payroll. It doesn't necessarily mean there's any problem. As you pointed out, if we're over 100% funded, then as long as we contribute more than the value of the benefits being earned each year, which is essentially the normal cost rate, it doesn't make a difference because we have some buffer of being over 100% funded. The problem is when you get below 100% funded, then any loss on those larger assets is larger compared to the payroll. As Nick said, instead of being a 1% loss being 1% of payroll, a 1% loss could be 6% of payroll.
Yeah, can I just add a couple things? One thing is that one of the big proponents of this is the CalSTRS actuary, and for him it's what they're dealing with every year, is that they're coming in and telling their employers that their contribution rate is going up or down. So this is a huge thing because their employers are actually seeing it directly in their contribution rate. We're just coming in every year with our evaluations like, well, you need to put in this much or that much, but their budgets are changing significantly every year, and so obviously it's back in the 1970s the changes were pretty small in contribution rates, and so it's, as I said, it's not quite as significant to you, but it does give some kind of measure. Just a second thing, I don't think Mark mentioned this, is that this kind of, you've seen it kind of the level off. We don't expect it just to keep growing. This is typical of a mature plan. We don't expect the situation that your volatility is going to go up. It kind of levels off once you kind of hit a full mature status, which I think you're pretty close to right now.
So is this measuring something different than from what you earlier mentioned about the effect of a delay in starting to address the unfunded liability makes it more expensive? Is this the same point, or are you measuring different things here?
This is a different thing, and I should say that this has no impact on the 12.9% of pay increase required. It has no impact on the approximately 0.5% a year increase by delaying by a year. It has no impact on any of those calculations because all of those calculations assume that we earn 7.5% in each future year. All of those calculations are what we call based on a deterministic model, which says, well, what if we just earn 7.5% exactly each future year? This gives us an idea of how future results might vary from those calculations based on 7.5% returns if we earn more, or particularly if we earn less than 7.5%.
Yeah, this is predicated on and is relevant if we earn more or less than the 7.5%.
Right.
If we earn 7.5%, do we stay at 5.8? If we just forever and ever earn 7.5%, as we assume, does that mean that the 5.8 stays the same?
If we move towards 100% funded, if we're 100% funded right now, the volatility index would be about 8 instead of 5.8. So what we'd like to be doing is moving towards that 8. As I said before, assets aren't bad. This is just a warning as to the potential volatility in the system's funding. And most of our calculations are based on a deterministic model which says, gee, what if we earn 7.5% every year? And one of the things we sometimes say is the one thing we can guarantee you is you're not going to earn 7.5% every year. You'll earn more some years, you'll earn less some years. And this is a way of getting a kind of a rule of thumb, a feel for how those gains or losses will impact the volatility of contributions. It's also a way of appreciating how the funding of the system is different than it was back in 1975 due to having more billions of dollars of assets.
But you just said that if we get closer to being funded, that the volatility index goes up.
Correct.
So it doesn't really tell us. I'm just trying to understand what it tells us.
Well,
Okay,
let me
hang on a second, because you guys have tried, and Ed's going to
I guess
throw
the other
his-
thing, I mean, the other value of this discussion is that one of the things that has come up when we had discussions with stakeholders and legislators about the issue is why can't you invest your way out of it? You did it before. And I think this helps, to the extent we can get people to understand the math behind it, it helps explain why what happened in the 1990s will not happen again, because of this relationship is such that we need much larger investment returns in order to invest our way out of it than was the case, even though we were worse off funded, 20 years ago. So apart from the value to you, it's also helpful, I think, to try to explain to others why it is that we cannot rely upon investment returns to address the problem.
Paul, that help at all? Probably not, huh?
Well, not to understand
I'd love a measure that explains that. What I'm saying is I don't understand how this measure explains that. I agree with you, and I'd love a really clear way of doing that. I'm still myself confused as to why this measure demonstrates that. That's all.
Okay, I have Michael and Harry, and I'll come back to you if need be after, because I don't know if this will help confuse things more or it will clarify things. So let's see what happens. Michael?
I have no doubt that this will not clarify things.
I knew I could.
I have the same kind of misunderstanding or lack of understanding as to what this is supposed to do. And I think the base of my confusion is the relevance to payroll. There's some actuarial speak going on here that I want to make sure I understand. I mean, you talk about this being a mature system, and based on the conversation before, I think what you were saying is we've got a lot of retirees as compared to actives.
Yes.
And because of that, even if we had no payroll, period, there would be a volatility index here. If we were 100% funded, because what you're really measuring is what's the impact of increase or decrease in the assets on the obligation to to make contributions sufficient to pay off the retiree liability that's out there.
As a percent of pay.
But I guess and I guess that's, I'm not saying that this is wrong, but to me, maybe it's a little bit confusing because the percent of pay is just another measuring stick. And that's why when you get up to 100%, there is still a number, because you're just saying, well, what if it goes up and down, and you've got to measure it against something, and you're measuring against payroll because that's the number that employers see all the time. And what they want to know is, payroll is a number that I know about, that I can see, I can predict to a certain extent, and I consider my contribution to the plan as a part of the payroll matrix. So how much is that going to vary depending upon what happens here? So I think that's what's going on. But at bottom, this is just, if I understand this correctly, you're basically saying that there's some uncertainty out there in the world, and here's the level of uncertainty. The level of uncertainty is really a function of the fact that we've got a lot of retirees, and the gains or losses on the assets is bigger because we've got a lot of retirees. The volatility index would be very low, regardless of the payroll, if we had just a few retirees.
Correct. Yeah, I like the way you put that, is the level of uncertainty. It's just it's informational. It does measure the level of uncertainty, which is much greater. I think Rick had a couple comments.
Yeah, let me try to go back a little bit and give a little kind of perspective on payroll. In the private sector, when a company has a certain level of payroll, that sort of indicates the size of the company. And in the state government, for instance, our teachers' payroll in California is a lot bigger than, say, the teachers' payroll of a small state. It sort of indicates, it's sort of a proxy for the amount of revenue that comes into a state and how much revenue the state has available to pay for things like pensions and so forth. So it's used as a collection measure for employers to just pay a percentage of pay, but it's also kind of used as a proxy as the ability of a state to pay. And I don't want to put it that way, but it is. So as the assets grow bigger and the losses grow bigger in dollar amounts, but the payroll stays the same, it's a much bigger burden than if the payroll of a particular entity had doubled or tripled. And that's sort of a proxy for that. So that's why measuring against the payroll is still an important measure versus some other known measure, because it's sort of a proxy for ability to pay also. So I think that's why another reason why payroll is used versus some other measure.
Yeah, because both of these numbers are typically lumped into a kind of a human resources cost box. Yes. But for our purposes, I think it's what I'm taking from this is at any level, the uncertainty just becomes has more of an impact on the potential contribution rate. The larger the class of retirees is.
Yes, because a 1% loss, which is not uncommon, has a much bigger impact on today's contribution than in 1975 or 1972 when we were 29% funded. So from a funded status perspective, we were in much worse shape than we are now. But a 1% loss then didn't have as bigger impact or a bigger increase in the contributions as a 1% loss today. So
okay, and just to make this a little more confusing, the volatility index, as you've framed it, would go down if the state were to double the number of active teachers.
Yes.
But it really has no real impact on the contribution obligation other than the fact that you've got more people paying into the system. But if you increase the payroll, but those people didn't come into the system, it would still change the index. Unless you're saying the payroll, the denominator is only those people who are in the system and paying into the system.
It is, the measure we use is only the payroll of people in the system.
Okay.
That's right. But if the payroll was to double and they weren't in the system, we wouldn't automatically collect the money because we collect a percentage of payroll. But it would indicate maybe a better ability for the state, which is the ultimate guarantee of the plan to pay for it.
Yeah, and that's why, to me, this is probably more beneficial for employers rather than for us. In the way it's being presented, because as was stated earlier, it's kind of confusing that even at 100% we'd have an 8% volatility ratio.
Yeah, I mean, it's like one of our clients, not one I work on, but one of Milliman's clients is Puerto Rico, and they have almost no assets. They're 9% funded. Well, if they have an asset loss, it's not that big of a deal for them. But if you're 100% funded, it's a huge deal if you lose 10% because you go from 100% to 90%. So it's just a measure, and it's just, and as I said, for someone like CalPERS, where it goes directly to their employers and their contribution rate is going up and down. I mean, it's a huge deal, and for us, it just means that when we come in, next year and talk to you about what the additional revenue needed is, just those assets, and you guys are already been well aware of this. The asset gain or loss has a big impact on what your additional revenue needed is.
Because one more question, and this goes to how this is useful to us, because typically when we get a number, when you boil something down to a number, the next thing I hear from actuaries and so on and so forth is, here's where you want to be. And I'm not sure I'm hearing, we've got a number. You pulled all this stuff together, put it in a box, and you spit out a number. But I'm not sure if we know on this side of the table where we would like that number to be. What's the optimum number that we'd like to achieve, and how to achieve it? I'm not even sure that there's an answer for that one. And so because of that, I'm not sure how we use this number.
Yeah, I mean, going to your question, I mean, that's what I talked about earlier. Is like, even targeting that 12.9%, it doesn't have any margin that if you do have negative experience in the future to pick that up. So optimally, we would like a larger number, but there's other factors involved there that we're well aware of. So yeah, it is. That's why we have to come up with, and we've worked with the board, and this 30 year is kind of the target to come up with some measure. But yeah, it's not just one number type of thing.
I'm done.
Harry, did you want to read? All right, I think we're good.